This morning, we have exclusive new CNN reporting. Donald Trump's lawyers are now in direct talks with the Justice Department about their criminal investigation of January 6th. The talks are said to be focused on whether conversations the former president had can be kept from investigators under executive privilege. CNN's Caitlin Palance is live for us in Washington with this very latest. Caitlin, what can you tell us?
Brianna, they're talking. That's Justice Department criminal investigators looking into January 6th and Donald Trump's defense lawyers. And what they're talking about right now is these conversations that Trump was having in the White House and his interest in keeping those conversations essentially from the federal grand jury probe. This development, and it's a notable one as we try to understand how much this criminal investigation is about Trump, it comes as part of the story of grand jury activity we've seen in recent weeks. Specifically, we know of those two top officials who worked for Mike Pence and then the two Pats, Cipollone, Philbin, from the White House counsel's office, all being subpoenaed to testify to the grand jury in D.C. But what we know of their testimony so far from the separate House investigation is those four have not been willing at this time to talk about direct conversations they had or witnessed with Trump. So over the last week, a court fight between the Justice Department and Trump over executive privilege has been brewing. We're expecting that could take place under seal. And that's where these direct talks come in. They're about Trump trying to prevent more disclosures to the grand jury about himself before and on January 6th. So history suggests he may not be successful in that because the Justice Department may be able to get access. But I also want to take a step back for a second. This first indication of direct talks is pretty telling about what the Justice Department is looking to learn. What's also pretty telling is what we are learning is happening behind the scenes with Trump and his lawyers. Our reporting team on this, we have heard from multiple sources that there is concern among Trump's lawyers that he could be indicted. They're working on defense strategies right now. But Trump being Trump, he's skeptical. Brianna, we have heard he's still keeping ties with people who may become central in this probe, even though his advisors tell him that may not be the best idea. Back to you.
Yeah, indeed. Caitlin Palance, thank you so much. Joining us now, Danya Perry, former federal prosecutor, and Ellie Honig, CNN senior legal analyst, who's also a former federal prosecutor. Ellie, what does it tell us that his lawyers are in direct contact with the DOJ, and what doesn't it tell us?
Well, it tells us, first of all, Brianna, that Donald Trump is taking this seriously, or at least his lawyers are taking this seriously. It is not unusual, I should say, for lawyers, for somebody who's not yet been indicted, to be in contact with prosecutors. It may sound like, wow, that's shocking, but it is quite common because as a defense lawyer, if you can establish contact with prosecutors, you can get perhaps information out of them. They're not going to tell you anything they shouldn't tell you, but you may get a sense of where they are in terms of timeline. You may get a sense of what they're interested in. That is very much in your client's interest. It does not tell us that Donald Trump is certain to get indicted. It tells us that it's in play, and both sides are aware of the possibility.
Danya, look, I mean, this is an unprecedented situation. There's nothing remotely like it in American history, but the closest is the Nixon presidency. And this debate around executive privilege. I mean, certainly weren't a lot of the fault lines made a lot clearer by Nixon v. United States that executive privilege holds, but not in the case of potential criminal conduct or orders?
Yeah, I think this is a relatively easy one, and it sounds like DOJ is getting out in front of it. They're preemptively trying to litigate this issue to get an answer as quickly as possible. So we have the Nixon precedent that is right on point, and that is not going to be in President Trump's favor. And then we've got more recently, Trump had brought in action when the National Archives was trying to produce documents to the Select Committee. And that was decided by the District Court, the Appellate Court, and the Supreme Court in a matter of just 3 months, where they handily said, no, this privilege is not yours, former President Trump. It belongs to the now current president. So I think for that reason, and also because a lot of the conversations he had were precisely not in his capacity as president. He was not, I mean, it is not the function of a president to sit there in place for 187 minutes and do nothing. So he was acting as a candidate and not an executive. And I think that this would be a quick trip to the Supreme Court to get a ruling that the executive privilege does not apply here.
Yeah, I agree that Donald Trump is unlikely to win in the courts on executive privilege, but the strategic upside there is delay. I mean, we know Donald Trump is the master of the art of delay. And if he does assert executive privilege and if he can't work it out with DOJ, he'll say, fine, let's go to court. Let's burn another 3, 4, 5, 6 months.
You heard, Danya, what Caitlin said at the end of her reporting there, which is Trump's lawyers are cautioning him it may not be the best idea to be talking to these witnesses. Oh, hello, of course it's not, right? But specifically, his attorneys are telling him or have told him that he needs to stop talking to Mark Meadows. Explain why they're telling him that.
I mean, as you point out, yeah, it's not likely to carry much weight with him. He's been told, I think, by every lawyer, and he's had many, not to talk to potential witnesses, not to talk to the press. He goes out there, he makes admissions, and he dangles carrots and he threatens witnesses. So Mark Meadows in particular obviously was right up close in the president's circle on January 6th, and also, of course, many of the events leading up to it. So he's going to have plenty of direct evidence that will be of great interest to prosecutors. And it is standard, right, for lawyers to give that cautionary warning to their clients. Don't tamper, don't interfere, stay away, it can only hurt you. But, you know, here we see this once again, and it does not sound like he is heeding that advice this time around either.
Joining us now is Alberto Gonzales. He's the former Attorney General and former counsel to President George W. Bush. General Gonzales, great to see you, sir. As you heard, Trump's lawyers reportedly believe that there will be indictments in this case, but you have voiced skepticism at the idea of Trump being indicted. Hold on. So I'm just asking, have the latest developments changed your mind around that?
Well, listen, I avoid skepticism because we simply don't know what kind of evidence the department's going to be successful in presenting before a jury. It's one thing to make a decision with respect to criminality of Donald Trump based upon the January 6th committee. It's quite another to actually convict him in a court of law. And so we have a rule of law in this country. And I think the Department of Justice is doing what they should be doing, gathering up evidence. And the Attorney General is going to make a calculated decision as to whether or not to move forward with an indictment and a future prosecution. You know, this has never been done before, where a former president has been indicted, charged, and prosecuted for actions committed while actually in office. So, if you're going to do this, you better be pretty sure you're going to be successful. Because if you indict him and you're not successful in prosecuting him, that's going to embolden future conduct. It's going to inspire his supporters. And so, you know, you want to be very, very careful about this. Listen, if the evidence is there, I have every belief and confidence that General Garland is going to move forward with the prosecution, because that is his obligation. And I know some people are concerned as to whether or not this is going to divert the attention of lawmakers for several months, whether a criminal trial will divert the attention of the American people for a long period of time. I think General Garland doesn't take that into consideration making this decision. If, in fact, the nation should be spared from a long criminal trial, that's a decision for the president. President Biden could issue a pardon, for example, much like President Ford did in the Nixon case.
Well, obviously, a ton of differences, but I want to zero in on something you said. You know, your confidence that Attorney General Garland, if the facts are there, would move forward with a prosecution. If the facts were there and you were Attorney General, is that the decision you would make?
Yes, I think so. That would be my job as the Attorney General. And the other thing that I would emphasize is that this is a decision to be made within the Department of Justice. I would not anticipate that there would be communications with the White House about this. In fact, General Garland may make the announcement or make the decision to move forward without informing the White House, because we have to have confidence, particularly with respect to Trump supporters. This is not a political decision involving the White House. This was made based upon the evidence, based upon the professional judgment of prosecutors within the Department of Justice. They'll make this decision, and they'll act on that decision, and the White House will accept that decision.
It's vitally important that justice be nonpartisan. I think people have gotten jaundice around that. Let's go to the question of executive privilege, because that's something you have unique insight to as a former White House counsel. You know, Nixon versus the United States seemed to set aside or clearly delineate the lines here, right? You know, executive privilege doesn't extend to potential criminal conduct. So how do you see this playing out?
I think, obviously, it's not surprising that the notion of executive privilege is an issue that's now being debated. But you're absolutely right with respect to the Nixon case. It's quite clear that the privilege is not absolute. It's not going to shield criminal conduct. particularly if there's no other way to get the information that's important for a criminal prosecution. And the other thing to remember is that it's a privilege that belongs, in essence, to the office of the president. The views of the sitting president carry much more weight in the courts in connection with the examination of executive privilege than a former president's. And so the fact that President Biden has an asserted privilege, I think is going to carry some additional weight. So all the considerations and factors that the court would typically consider in whether or not to reward or approve of executive privilege simply don't exist here in the favor of President Trump.